The wind howled like a hungry wolf against the walls of the tiny cabin. It was a sound that promised nothing but loneliness, a sound that seeped through the cracks in the wood and settled deep in your bones. Inside, a single lantern flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. Martha Caldwell sat at the table, a needle and thread in her hand. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from a grief that had become a permanent part of her. She was mending her son's shirt, but with every stitch, she was trying to mend a life that was torn clean in two. In the corner, her children slept. Rose, so small and fragile, whimpered in her sleep, burying her face into her brother's shoulder. Sammy, only 8 years old, pulled her closer. He was just a boy, but the world had already forced him to carry the weight of a man. "It's all right, Rosie," he whispered, his own voice thick with tears he refused to let fall. He didn't believe it, not for a second. Martha's needle stopped. She held her breath, listening to the sound that haunted her nights. It wasn't a loud cry. It was worse. It was the quiet, hopeless whimper of a child calling for a father who would never, ever answer. Her heart felt like it was being crushed. "They've cried for a father's love every night," she whispered into the darkness. Her eyes drifted to the cabin door. Beyond it lay a world that had turned its back on her. The town, with its judgmental eyes and cruel whispers. She remembered her last trip there, the sneer on Abigail Trent's face, the hungry way Tobias Finch looked at her. A woman with no husband was a woman with no shield. In their eyes, she wasn't a person. She was a problem, a burden, a broken thing. The lantern sputtered, threatening to die. She bent her head, focusing on the stitch, on the single thread she was trying to hold together. In the corner, Sammy's jaw tightened in his sleep, as if he were fighting battles even in his dreams. She tried to remember her husband's laugh, but the memory was faded, like an old photograph left in the sun. All that was left was the silence he left behind. The next morning came cold and gray. The children ate their stale bread in silence, their small faces already etched with a sorrow too big for their years. "We'll fetch flour today," Martha said, her own stomach twisting at the thought of facing the town again. Sammy just nodded, his eyes dark. He squared his little shoulders, trying to be the protector he so desperately wanted to be. The town was just as she remembered. Frozen mud, suspicious eyes, and the biting wind of gossip. Abigail Trent stood outside the mercantile, her lips pursed like she'd just tasted something sour. "A woman alone is like a roof with holes," she said, her voice loud enough for Martha to hear. "Can't keep anything decent inside." Martha's face burned with shame. She pushed into the store, where the silence was even louder than the whispers. Tobias Finch was leaning against the counter. He was a big man, and he used his size to make other people feel small. "Need a hand with that flour, Widow Caldwell?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. His eyes crawled over her, making her skin feel dirty. "Be a shame if it proved too heavy for such slight arms." "I can manage," Martha said, her voice tight. His smirk widened. "Well, if ever you find the nights too long, my fire stays lit." The insult landed like a slap. Sammy clenched his tiny fists, a fire in his eyes, but Martha pulled him away before he could do anything. She paid for the flour and fled, the shame sticking to her like mud. But then, as they stepped back onto the street, everything went quiet. A man was walking into town. He was tall, impossibly tall, and built like a mountain. His name was Jonas McGraw, and it was a name spoken only in hushed, fearful tones. They called him a beast, a savage. They said he'd killed a wolf with his bare hands and ate a bear raw. He walked in a bubble of silence and fear. Men looked away. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts. Even the sheriff, a man paid to be brave, looked uneasy. "That's him," Sammy whispered, his voice a mix of terror and awe. Rose clutched her brother's arm. "He's scary." Martha kept her eyes down, her heart pounding against her ribs. But something made her look up. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept over the crowd, dismissing them all. Until they met hers. For a single breathless moment, the world stopped. She felt a jolt, a strange pull she couldn't explain. It was more than fear. It was something else, something deeper, like looking into a well and not knowing how far down it went. Then he turned and disappeared into the blacksmith shop, leaving a silence that felt heavier than before. That night, a blizzard hit. Snow and wind clawed at the cabin, and Martha held her children close, trying to soothe their fears with stories she didn't believe herself. After they finally fell into a restless sleep, she went to check the fire. And that's when she heard it. A sound. A dull, rhythmic thudding from outside. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed the old rifle from above the mantel, its weight heavy and unfamiliar in her trembling hands. Slowly, carefully, she opened the cabin door. The wind tore at her, whipping snow into her face like tiny needles. And there, in the swirling white, she saw him. It was Jonas McGraw. He had an axe in his hand, and he was splitting her logs. His massive shoulders heaved with each swing, the sound of the axe biting into wood a steady, powerful beat in the heart of the storm. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word. He just worked. When he was done, he stacked the wood neatly by her door, turned, and vanished back into the blizzard as silently as he had appeared. Martha stood there, frozen, the rifle hanging uselessly in her hands. She opened her mouth to call out, to say thank you, but no words came out. The next morning, the children found the woodpile. Sammy's eyes went wide with wonder. Rose clapped her hands in delight. All Martha could do was whisper to the empty prairie. Thank you. A few days later, she saw him again down by the creek. Rose, holding a small wildflower she had picked, did something that made Martha's heart stop. Before Martha could stop her, the little girl toddled right up to the mountain man. She held out the flower, her tiny hand trembling. Jonas looked down at her. His face, marked with scars that told 100 violent stories, was impossible to read. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then, he did something no one expected. He knelt down, and with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man his size, he took the tiny flower from her. He nodded once, a slow, solemn gesture. Martha watched, unable to breathe. She saw the way his massive, calloused hand dwarfed the delicate bloom. It was a small thing, a nothing. But that night, when she heard Abigail Trent's poison spreading through the town, the widow lets her children near that beast now. She didn't feel shame. She felt a flicker of something else, defiance. Still, the town's judgment was a heavy weight. Was she putting her children in danger? Every instinct she had screamed that this man, this silent giant, was not the monster they said he was. But the whispers were relentless. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of bruised purple, she stood at her cabin door, looking toward the dark mountains where he lived. "Who are you, Jonas McGraw?" she whispered. The only answer was the silence of the vast, empty land. But far away, at the edge of the forest, a shadow moved. A solitary figure, watching, waiting, and Martha felt it in her soul. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The woodpile Jonas left was more than just wood. Every time Martha threw a log on the fire, she saw his hands, powerful and scarred, and she remembered the silent kindness he had shown. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. The children weren't afraid of him anymore. Now, they spoke his name with a kind of hushed reverence. Sammy would square his shoulders and try to walk with the same silent, deliberate stride when he thought no one was looking. Jonas kept his distance, a ghost at the edge of their world, but the space between them was shrinking. One afternoon, Martha was trying to fix a broken fence post. She strained, pulling with all her might, but the rotted wood wouldn't budge. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. It was Jonas. He didn't say a word. He just reached down and pulled the post from the ground as if it were a weed. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements sure and steady. He was a man who knew how to fix broken things. Sammy, growing bolder, crept closer. "Can you show me?" the boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jonas stopped. He looked at the boy, his stormy eyes softening just a fraction. He knelt, took a hammer, and gently guided Sammy's small hands to strike the nail. He didn't speak, but in that moment, he gave the boy something he hadn't had in a long time. A father's guidance. A sense of pride. Watching them, Martha felt a war inside her. To accept this man's help was to invite more scorn, more poison from the town. But looking at her son's face, lit up with a joy she hadn't seen in months, she knew. The whispers of the town didn't matter, not when weighed against her son's happiness. That evening, as they ate their meager supper, Sammy did something that shocked her. "Mr. Jonas," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Will you stay?" The question hung in the air. Jonas stood in the doorway, half in shadow, half in the warm glow of the firelight. The silence stretched on, and Martha was sure he would turn and walk away. But he didn't. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. And he sat down at their table. It was a clumsy meal, full of silence and unspoken words. But it was the first time in a long time that the little cabin felt full. Rose shyly offered him a piece of her bread, and he took it, his rough hand gentle as he accepted her small gift. Martha watched them, a dangerous feeling blooming in her chest. It felt like hope, and hope was a terrifying thing. The town, of course, noticed. The whispers grew louder, sharper. "She lets that wild man inside her home now," Abigail Trent hissed. "Can't get a decent man, so she takes a beast," Tobias Finch sneered at the mercantile. Even the sheriff, Amos Grady, paid her a visit. He tipped his hat, but his eyes were cold. "You'd best mind your company, Martha," he said, his voice low. "This town don't take kindly to shadows. Folks see 'em at your place, they'll talk, and talk becomes trouble." "What they see and what is true are not the same," Martha replied, her own voice shaking slightly. The sheriff sighed, a flicker of pity in his eyes that felt worse than scorn. "Truth don't always matter more than talk, Martha. You protect your children." His words were a warning, a threat. That night, she sat by the fire, the sheriff's words echoing in her mind. Jonas was there, quietly mending a broken chair. The children were asleep, peaceful for once. She looked at this silent man, this outcast. Her late husband had been full of charming words and empty promises. But it was this man's silence that felt solid. It was his presence that made the walls of her broken home feel stronger. But the fragile peace they had found was about to be shattered. The next time they went to town, Tobias Finch was waiting for them. "Look at them," he said to the crowd that had gathered. "Orphans begging for scraps. And you," he sneered at Martha, "pretending a few kindnesses makes a man out of that mountain brute." Sammy, his face red with rage, couldn't take it anymore. He lunged at Finch, his tiny fists raised. "Don't you talk about my ma like that." Tobias laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. He shoved the boy, hard. Sammy went flying, hitting the dirt and splitting his lip. Rose screamed. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Before Martha could even react, Jonas was there. He moved like a storm, silent and sudden. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He just stepped between Tobias and the boy. He stood there, a mountain of a man, his eyes as cold and hard as granite. Tobias Finch, who had never backed down from a fight in his life, took a step back. The crowd went silent, the air thick with tension. The silence of Jonas McGraw was more terrifying than any threat. Sheriff Grady pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "That's enough," he said, but his voice wavered. He turned to Jonas. "This town don't need your kind, stirring up fear." And for the first time, Jonas spoke. His voice was like rocks grinding together, rough and deep. But the words were steady, unshakable. "Maybe the town don't," he said, his gaze fixed on the sheriff. "But them children do." The words hit the town square like a bolt of lightning. The sheriff froze. Abigail Trent's mouth hung open. Even Tobias looked pale. For all the nights Martha had cried, for all the prayers she had whispered for her children, here was a man who stood for them. A stranger, an outcast, a beast. And with just 10 words, he had spoken a truth so powerful it shook the entire town to its foundation. The sheriff slowly lowered his hand from his gun. "Go on home, all of you," he muttered. The crowd broke apart, but something had changed. The whispers were still there, but now they were mixed with something else. Awe, respect, fear. Back at the cabin, the silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. The children clung to Jonas, their fear from the day breaking down the last of their walls. Martha looked at her children, their faces buried in the rough fabric of the mountain man's coat, and she saw it. The answer to her prayers. It wasn't the answer she expected. He wasn't a charming prince or a respectable townsman. He was a scarred, silent man with a past shrouded in darkness, but he was the one who stood up when everyone else stayed silent. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Martha looked Jonas in the eye. "They say you're a monster," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He didn't flinch. He just held her gaze. "What do you say?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Martha's heart pounded in her chest. She thought of his gentleness with the flower, his patience with her son, the way he had faced down an entire town for them. "I say they're wrong," she whispered. A flicker of something, pain, relief, a dozen emotions she couldn't name, passed through his eyes. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. But as the fire burned low, a new, cold fear crept into Martha's heart. A man like Jonas didn't get scars like that by accident. He didn't earn a reputation like that for no reason. He was protecting them from the town. But who, she wondered, was going to protect them from him? The quiet that followed the confrontation in town was heavy, like the air before a storm. Jonas stayed. He didn't move into the cabin, but he was a constant presence, a silent guardian who fixed the roof, reinforced the walls, and taught Sammy how to track a rabbit. He was weaving himself into the fabric of their lives, and Martha found herself letting him. But the town was watching. And waiting. One evening, Jonas didn't return from his hunting trip at his usual time. A knot of anxiety tightened in Martha's stomach. As dusk bled into night, the knot grew into a cold, hard dread. Then she heard horses. It was Sheriff Grady and a posse of 3 men. They didn't look friendly. "Evening, Martha," the sheriff said, not bothering to dismount. "We're looking for McGraw." "He's not here," Martha said, standing in the doorway, the old rifle in her hands. "We know," Grady said with a smug smile. "We've got him." They parted, and Martha's blood ran cold. Between their horses, tied and bleeding from a gash on his head, was Jonas. He was on his feet, but just barely, his massive frame slumped in defeat. "What is this?" Martha demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "Justice," the sheriff said. "A trapper was found dead up in the mountains, mauled, looks like the work of a bear, or a beast." He spat the last word, his eyes full of triumph. "We're taking him in for murder." It was a lie. Martha knew it was a lie, but looking at the hard, determined faces of the men with him, she knew the truth didn't matter. This was their chance to get rid of the man they feared, the man who had shamed them. "You can't," she whispered. "It's already done," Grady said, turning his horse. He'll hang by morning." They rode off, leaving Martha alone in the doorway, the sound of their laughter echoing in the cold night air. The hope she had so carefully nurtured turned to ash in her mouth. She had been a fool. She had let herself believe that one good man could stand against a whole town full of hate. But as she looked at the mountains, a new feeling began to burn through the despair. Anger. Hot, white anger. They had taken the one person who had shown her and her children any kindness. They had condemned an innocent man, and she was not going to let them get away with it. She didn't know how, but she was going to save Jonas McGraw, even if it meant burning the whole town to the ground. With Jonas gone, the silence in the cabin was a crushing weight. The children were terrified. Sammy tried to be brave, but Martha could see the fear in his eyes. Rose just cried. Martha didn't have time for tears. She had until morning. She tore the cabin apart, searching for something, anything, that could help. A clue, a secret, a weapon. In a dusty old trunk filled with her late husband David's belongings, her hand brushed against something hard sewn into the lining of his winter coat. Her fingers fumbled with the stitches. She ripped the seam open. Inside was not a weapon. It was a book. A small, leather-bound journal. Her husband's journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first few pages were what she expected. Notes about the farm, the weather, worries about money. But then, the entries changed. David wrote about a discovery, a secret he had stumbled upon, a silver vein, hidden deep in the hills on their property. It was enough to make them rich, to give them a life she could only dream of. He wrote that he had told one person, a man he thought he could trust, a man named Tobias Finch. Martha's heart stopped. The journal entries grew more frantic. David wrote that Finch had become greedy, demanding a larger share. He had made threats. David was scared. The last entry was dated the day before he died. "Finch is bringing the sheriff with him tomorrow. He says Grady will make it all official. I don't trust them. I met a man in the mountains, a prospector named Jonas. He's a good man. He's going to watch my back. If anything happens to me, he knows the truth." The journal fell from her hands. It all clicked into place. The sneers, the whispers, the way Finch and the sheriff were so desperate to drive her off her land. They didn't just want the land. They wanted what was in it. Her husband hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered. And Jonas wasn't just a kind stranger. He was the only witness. That's why they hated him. That's why they feared him. He was the one man who could bring their whole world crashing down. They hadn't just arrested Jonas for a murder he didn't commit. They were silencing him. The first hint of dawn was touching the sky. Time was running out. Martha grabbed the journal, her mind racing. The town was against her. The law was against her. She had one chance. One desperate, insane idea. She saddled their old horse, her movements swift and sure. She pulled a sleeping Sammy up behind her and wrapped Rose in a blanket, clutching her to her chest. She wasn't running to the town. She was running away from it, toward the mountains, toward the place where the trapper had been found dead. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew that the truth of what happened to that trapper was the only thing that could save Jonas. And as she rode, with her two small children clinging to her, she had never felt more alone or more terrified. The mountains were cold and unforgiving. The trail was barely visible, but Martha pushed on, guided by a desperate hope. She found the place the sheriff had mentioned. It wasn't hard to spot. The snow was trampled, stained with blood, and there were tracks. Not just boot prints, animal tracks, big ones, wolf tracks, a lot of them. But there was something else, something that made the hair on her arms stand up. A drag mark, leading away from the scene, into the dense forest. It looked like someone had dragged a body. She followed the trail, her heart pounding with every step. The tracks led her to a small, hidden cave. She hesitated at the entrance. then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. It was the coppery scent of blood. And then she saw him. It was the trapper. He was alive. Barely. His leg was mangled, wrapped in a crude bandage. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. He saved me," the trapper rasped. "Who did?" Martha asked, her voice trembling. "The mountain man," he said. "Jonas, a wolf pack. They cornered me. I thought I was dead. He came out of nowhere. Fought them off, with nothing but a knife in his bare hands. He killed 3 of them before the rest ran. He dragged me here, bandaged my leg. He saved my life." The story was the opposite of what the sheriff had said. Jonas hadn't murdered the trapper. He had saved him. The dead trapper was a lie, a story concocted to get rid of Jonas for good. But that wasn't the biggest shock. The trapper pointed a shaking finger toward the back of the cave. "He told me to give this to you, if he didn't make it back." In the shadows, leaning against the cave wall, was a heavy leather satchel. Martha opened it. It was full of silver ore, and on top of the silver was a signed confession. It was from the sheriff's deputy. It detailed everything. How Finch had paid him to lie, to say he saw Jonas attack the trapper. How Finch and the sheriff had murdered her husband all those months ago. Jonas hadn't just been protecting her. He had been gathering proof. He was trying to bring them down, not with violence, but with the truth. And he had been one step away when they caught him. Suddenly, a voice from the mouth of the cave made her jump. "I knew you'd be trouble." It was Sheriff Grady, and he wasn't alone. Tobias Finch was with him, a cruel smile on his face. "Looks like the widow went and stuck her nose where it doesn't belong," Finch sneered. Grady drew his gun. "Give me the satchel, Martha. We'll say the wolves got you and the children too. A tragic end to a tragic story." They were going to kill them all. Right here, where no one would ever find them. Martha's mind raced. She was trapped. She looked at her children, huddled behind her. She looked at the gun in the sheriff's hand. It was over. But then she looked at the wounded trapper. At the satchel full of truth. She thought of Jonas, waiting to be hanged for a crime he didn't commit. For a crime of heroism. And the fear was burned away by a cold, hard rage. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She clutched the satchel to her chest. "If you want it," she said, her eyes locking with the sheriff's, "you'll have to come and get it." Finch laughed and took a step forward. And that's when a shadow fell across the entrance of the cave. It was a mountain of a man, his face a mask of fury. His hands were bound in front of him with rope, but the rope was frayed, hanging by a thread. It was Jonas. He had broken free. "Get away from them," he snarled. And his voice was no longer the quiet rumble she knew. It was the roar of a grizzly bear. The sheriff and Finch spun around, their faces pale with shock. Grady raised his gun. But he was too slow. With a roar, Jonas lunged. He snapped the last of his bonds as if they were thread. He hit the sheriff like a freight train, sending the man flying. The gun clattered across the cave floor. Finch scrambled for it, but Jonas was on him in a second. He lifted the big man off the ground with one hand, his fingers digging into Finch's throat. "You took everything from me," Jonas choked out, his voice thick with a pain that went deeper than any scar. "You left me for dead. You killed my friend." He was talking about her husband. For a moment, Martha saw the beast the town whispered about. She saw the killer. And she knew, in that instant, that he could crush Tobias Finch's throat and not think twice. "Jonas, no!" she screamed. Her voice cut through his rage. He looked at her, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. He saw her, clutching the satchel. He saw the children hiding behind her. And the beast retreated. Slowly, he lowered Finch to the ground. The man collapsed, gasping for air. Jonas looked at the sheriff, who was crawling for his gun. He kicked it away. It was over. They rode back into town not as outcasts, but as avengers. Jonas, Martha, and the children, with the wounded trapper on Martha's horse. They rode straight to the center of town, where the gallows were being prepared. The crowd went silent when they saw them. They saw the trapper, alive. They saw the satchel in Martha's hand. She held up the journal. She held up the confession. And she told them everything. Her voice, once timid and broken, was now strong and clear. It rang through the town square, a voice of truth that could no longer be silenced. She told them about the silver, the murder, the lies. She told them how Jonas had saved the trapper, how he had tried to expose the truth. The town stood in stunned silence. The people they had trusted, the men who were supposed to protect them, were murderers and thieves. The man they had feared and hated was a hero. The truth once revealed was like a flood. It washed away the lies, the fear, the prejudice. The crowd turned on Finch and the sheriff. There was no trial. There was just the raw, immediate justice of the frontier. They were run out of town, lucky to escape with their lives. In the aftermath, the town looked at Martha with new eyes. They saw not a weak widow, but a woman of incredible strength. They looked at Jonas not as a beast, but as the man who had saved them all from the corruption that had festered in their midst. The silver vein on her land meant she and the children would never go hungry again. But it was the truth that had truly set them free. That evening, Martha stood with Jonas on the porch of her small cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky. The children were inside, sleeping peacefully, for the first time without fear. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, peaceful. "You knew," she said, "all this time. You were watching over us." He nodded. "I made a promise to David," he said, his voice quiet, "to look after his family. I failed him once. I wasn't going to fail him again." He turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw no shadows in his eyes, just a clear, steady light. "The town was wrong about you," she said softly. He almost smiled. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I was a beast, until you and those children reminded me how to be a man." The prairie was quiet. The wind whispered through the grass, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like a promise, a new beginning. They had faced down the darkness together, the widow, the outcast, and two small children. They had found their justice, and in the process, they had found something else. A family. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice from the Wild West.